I'm ready.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'm glad to introduce tonight's speaker, Andrew Kushner, and the title will be Chinese Superstition as a Process of Thought. I know Andrew for a while, and he's a graduate student at Zhengda National Political University in Taipei, Department of History, and he studies Chinese and Taiwanese history, and the problems with superstition are his very big field of interest. His Chinese is also very good, and he's a very diligent student. So, probably everyone has at least some idea about superstition. Well, superstition is a belief or notion not based on knowledge or reason, and is related to a fear of the unknown, or trust in magic or chance, or a false conception of causality. Almost everywhere in the world there is a superstition, and superstition has been studied by a lot of scientists, ethnologists, sociologists, religion scholars, and others. So, in China also there is superstition. And it is very interesting. If you read his abstract that he prepared, there were some questions he posed there, like, is superstition a legitimate way of thinking today, especially in this scientific age? And he mentioned there that Chinese superstition is related to Yin-Yang, the 5 elements, and the 8 Trigrams. So superstition in China is actually part of the culture. Like you can see, like Yin-Yang is part of superstition, it's also part of philosophy, it's part of nutritionism, it's part of art, so it's everywhere. So Chinese superstition is a really specific topic, and now I give the stand to Andrew.
Thank you. So actually that was a very good introduction. I wasn't quite expecting that was a much better definition of superstition than I could provide. Dan, how does that? Yeah. Okay. So I just want to start off my talk with a quote from a philosopher by the name of Raymond Smullyan. And that is, superstition is bad luck. So I don't want to get anyone to get the idea during this talk that I'm advocating superstition or that I think you should be superstitious. That's not the impression I'm trying to convey at all. So this thought process that led to this talk began when I started reading a work by a scholar named Henri Doré, who was a French sinologist and Jesuit who lived in China, in Jiangsu province, in the late 19th century. And Henri Doré wrote a magisterial 10-volume work called Researches into Chinese Superstition. And unfortunately, I couldn't bring it with me here today because the copy at the library you can't check out. I had to take notes by hand in the stacks. But I did make a few photocopies. It has a lot of great color plates, and I just photocopied a few of the images that I thought would be relevant. So you can pass those around. So Henri Doré was a Jesuit and a comparative religious scholar, which was a field pioneered by the Jesuits, and they did a lot for early sinology in the West. And as such, he was researching Chinese religion and Chinese superstition very much from a heresiology perspective. He was not taking this seriously in any way. This was primarily a question of how he could convert the natives more effectively. So that comes out throughout his book, and I just thought I would share a couple choice paragraphs. Real China exists little in the open ports. Civilization has there done its work, and raised the Chinaman to a higher level than his fellow countrymen. Whosoever, therefore, would study him in his real... Okay, well that one, unfortunately, I left the latter part of that quote at home, but I have another one. Religion, I got the phrase Chinaman, which was mostly what I was going for. Religion in China is not an effort to apprehend the infinite, love and enjoy it. it is not man's nature clamoring for food necessary for life and perfection, nor is it a duty to serve the deity directly. So far as these 3 volumes impress us, it yokes rather the spiritual world, the superhuman element in which man believes, to the needs and welfare of humanity. Man, having made his gods, has rendered them subservient to all his needs and purposes. Such a system, utilitarian and selfish, utterly degrades the moral character of the deity as conceived by all nations, and offers to man but a delusive and beggarly happiness here and hereafter. So, it's not the most balanced portrayal of Chinese superstition. Now, I got to thinking as I was reading this book, and it's worth mentioning, the book, he was visiting China at a time which is very much the low point in China's history, pretty much ever. Culturally, militarily, internationally, economically. So it's understandable that he would have had the type of impression that he did. And you get a sense, reading this volume, you get a sense of the sort of insanity that could come out of such a widespread and prevalent belief in superstition and the sort of suffering it brought upon people. But at the same time, I started to consider, maybe there's something going on here which Henri Doré wasn't seeing. Maybe these aren't just a hodgepodge of irrational beliefs, but there might actually be a logic underlying them. I started looking into anthropology and the way it's studied magical thinking over the last 100 years. And that was pioneered first by a Scotsman named Fraser. And he coined the term sympathetic magic to describe the panoply of religious and superstitious and religious practices that we find in pre-civilized peoples. And he broke, he sort of broke all superstitious and magical thinking down into a few key concepts or ideas. And he wrote, if we analyze the principles of thought on which magic is based, they will probably be found to resolve themselves into 2. First, that like produces like, or that an effect resembles its cause. And second, that things which have once been in contact with each other continue to act on each other at a distance after the physical contact has been severed. The former principle may be called the law of similarity, the latter the law of contact or contagion. From the first of these principles, namely the law of similarity, the magician infers that he can produce any effect he desires, merely by imitating it. From the second, he infers that whatever he does to a material object will affect equally the person with whom the object was once in contact, whether it formed part of his body or not. So, one example that you find in Henri Doré's work of this type of superstition is the belief, still prevalent in Taiwan and I believe China, that a pregnant woman should not have scissors in her bedroom. The idea being that scissors can snip the umbilical cord of the baby in utero and cause it to be a stillborn child. Now, this is not an example of logical thinking. The idea, the threat is not that someone could use the scissors to cut the umbilical cord. It's that the presence of the scissors magically increases the probability of a stillborn child. So, what this is it's a form of correspondence. It's the idea that objects across different categories can impact on one another non-causally from a distance. And the mechanism by which they do so is by a form of resonance. That basically the idea is everything in the universe, be it people, it's not just musical frequencies, people, animals, plants, inanimate objects all have a vibratory frequency, and through this frequency can cause interference or harmonic properties in other objects, and they can do so across conceptual categories. So it's not just that objects can impact upon objects, but ideas can impact upon objects, or objects can impact upon ideas, or sensations could impact upon actions from far away. So these are all characteristics of what Fraser would call basically primitive or magical thinking, which he distinguished from religious or mythic thinking and modern or scientific or rational thinking. And he was a 19th century Victorian, so he believed very strongly that there was a clear progression of civilization from one towards the other, and that this was an ascendancy towards a greater state of perfection. Subsequent anthropologists have looked at it in a little more favorable of a light. So another principle which animates this pre-modern conception of the world is that of anthropomorphization. So the idea is that, okay, for us, I'm a person here communicating with you here tonight. This is a beer that I'm drinking, and I can have thoughts and communicate. A beer cannot. To a tribal or pre-civilization, primary people's minds, that's not the case at all. The beer is a person. It has thoughts, it has feelings, it can communicate. And that's true of the entire world, which is animated by a common vitalistic principle. If scholars have looked at this type of magical thinking, and some have commented that basically what underlies all of it is a form of category error. And we in the West come out of a philosophical tradition which is very informed by Aristotle in particular. And not just him, but throughout the philosophical tradition we have a real interest in categorization of concepts. So in the ancient and medieval world you have the concept of a chain of being, where you have the mineral kingdom, then you have the vegetable kingdom, the animal kingdom, people, angels, and then God at the top. And the idea is these are all separated categorically from one to the next. And the higher categories can impact upon the lower, but the lower cannot impact upon the higher. From a magical thinking or a pre-categorical thinking perspective, that's not the case at all. The lower can impact upon the higher through the principle of like imitates like. And in fact, there are no categories at all. Everything is mutually interpenetrating all the time. So it's a connected world. It's not a world which is broken up into conceptual chunks, which are basically, which relate meaningfully to language. The idea is not that language corresponds to the actually existing universe, and we can use language to describe that. That's not their assumption at all. Okay, why am I interested in China and its superstitions? I just described what the archaeologist K.C. Zhang talks about as the shamanistic substratum of Chinese religion. And it's the same substratum which informs pre-civilized religions all over the world, in Eurasia, in Africa, in Mesoamerica. What's interesting about China is, unlike almost every other civilization out there, it's experienced a continuous development since that time, and it was never ruptured principally by monotheism or by total conquest by another civilization. So in Chinese thought you see a real continuity back to this shamanistic past, with subsequent accretions from the development of the state, which changed things greatly. And that change happens between the Warring States period and the Han Dynasty, in what philosophers and intellectual historians refer to as the Axial Age. And this is a period of time where, not just in China, but all over the world, people began asking some very different questions about the universe and why it works the way it does. So, in China, you have Confucius, you have Lao Tzu. In India, you have the Buddha. In Persia, you have Zoroaster. In Israel, you have the Hebrew prophets. And in Greece, you have the beginning of the philosophical tradition. This all happened within a very short 100-year time span, simultaneously. And no one can really quite explain why. So, what's interesting is, and this is also the beginning of the developments of Greek science. Something very different happened in China, and it went along a very different road from the development of Greek science. Because what it did at this point is it kept those same magical or shamanistic ideas which were existent in its culture from prehistory, and it began to systematize them. And scholars refer to this development as the theory of systematic correspondence. And by far the most famous of these is the Yin-Yang theory, which I believe everyone is reasonably familiar with. A little less famous would be the five elements theory and the Bagua or basically the Yin-Yang theory, which are both also developments on the Yin-Yang. You can derive both those systems from Yin and Yang. And so these systems are used for different sorts of things. Yin-Yang is used for all sorts of things. Five elements is used in Chinese medicine, and it's particularly good at understanding natural systems and organisms. The I Ching is principally used for divination, fortune telling. And so all of these systems have so they're interesting to historians of science because they are not science, but they're not superstition either. They're what they refer to as a proto-science. It's a systematic attempt to look at the natural world according to a certain framework, but it is non-causal, and it's not experimental in the same way that modern science is. So, besides superstition, these systems have a number of applications towards which they were used quite successfully in ancient China. One example would be in engineering and architecture, where Yin-Yang was used quite extensively. The reason being simple, basically the sky is Yang and the earth is Yin, so the chi of the earth is gravity. So if you can understand how gravity works, you'll be pretty good at building buildings. Another very concrete thing towards which these ideas of systematic correspondence can be used towards is mnemonic systems, memorization. And this was used very extensively not only in China, but in the West as well, where it developed into a highly refined art. Beginning with Roman orators, initially would, in order to memorize long speeches like the ones what I'm giving you here, they would envision a palace or a house with many rooms oriented in space, and they would remember things in the room. And then they would put the different parts of their speech in the rooms and envision themselves moving through the rooms. And so they were able to memorize long speeches that way. And over time, people began syncing that method with Western occultism, astrology, and tarot, and it became sort of an art that people would memorize encyclopedic amounts of information through the use of these mnemonic devices. So these are just a couple concrete examples of what you can use systematic correspondence for. The big example, which I kind of want to talk a little bit about, is medicine. Now, unfortunately, I don't have enough time here tonight to persuade you of the efficacy of Chinese medicine. That will be another speech for another time, and it's something I'm not entirely convinced of myself. But what I can say is that there appear to have been some big changes in the acceptance of Chinese medicine in America since I left for Taiwan. That it was still kind of a fringe New Agey thing when I left the country. Now HMOs largely cover it because they don't care if it conforms to their theoretical perspective. They just care if it saves them money. The military is using it rather extensively in Afghanistan, especially. And my dad works at a free clinic in basically a ghetto where there's people dealing crack out in front of the clinic, and they have acupuncture there. So it clearly has reached a bit of saturation in mainstream society. Now, how does Chinese medicine work? It works according to a very different set of principles from Western evidence-based scientific medicine. And the way it works is all of the processes in the body are basically broken down according to this 5-element classification. So you have 5 organs, and they're not really organs at all. They're not physical organs, they're processes in your body. So they're your digestion, your endocrine system, your breathing, your emotions, your thought, which is regarded as being on par with those other biological processes. That's quite interesting in and of itself. And so it's the different processes in the body are corresponding with the different organs. And then, because they're corresponded in turn with different types of food, different times of the year, different times of day, they're used to make all sorts of medical observations. And the way a Chinese doctor sees a patient is really quite different from the way a Western doctor sees a patient. A Western doctor, if you go in and they'll ask you what's wrong, and you say, my knee hurts, and then they'll look at your knee, and then they'll write a prescription or make a diagnosis. Probably not in that order. So the way Chinese medicine works is quite different. What they'll do is they'll start asking you questions unrelated to the illness. Say, okay, about your personality, about your lifestyle, about your family background, about all or other sorts of things which have nothing to do with the illness you're complaining of. What they do is they begin assembling a picture of who you are holistically as a person, and how all of these factors in your lifestyle are relating to your medical complaint. So these are 2 different types of reasoning, and they're called analytic and synthetic reasoning. The Western modality would be considered analytic. The Chinese would be considered synthetic. And analytic reasoning is principally associated with modern science. Synthetic reasoning, some examples of uses of synthetic reasoning would be the way a detective works, which is really quite similar to the way a Chinese doctor works. Is they basically get a bunch of facts about the case, they lay them out on the table, and they start making connections between the facts and developing a hunch about the way, about the facts of the case. Another good example would be, okay, I'm in a history department. All good historians work in this way. Good historians are trained not to think in terms of historical causation. Like the War of 1812 happened because grain prices went up in Russia. That's bad history. What a historian does is they create a picture of an age and all of the different interconnecting factors, or an age or an event or an individual, but they look at how events interrelate, not attempt to isolate causes. Here's an example of something you'd require synthetic reasoning for. Marcus, how many brothers and sisters do you have?
2 brothers.
Okay, and are you the oldest or the youngest?
Young.
Okay, so could we reasonably say that all people who are the youngest of 2 older brothers are a certain way, have a certain personality type? Probably not. I'm an only child. I observe that only children are usually either very extroverted and crave other people's attention and validation, or they're very introverted and don't give a shit about other people. I tend to be more on the latter end of the spectrum. But nothing you can't say that only children are this way, or only children are this way. What is it depends on the other facts of their life and how they turn out, and it happens systematically. So it cannot be answered through inductive or analytic reasoning. Now, I'd just like to mention these two forms of reasoning also correspond to the way that the brain functions. Your left side of your brain is concerned with logic. It is concerned with language and symbolic reasoning. It's what computer programmers would call a serial processor. Right side of your brain is concerned with spatial orientation. It's concerned with relationships with other people and objects. It's concerned with creativity and a host of other things besides. But it is what would be considered a parallel processor. To the right brain, there is no time. Everything is happening all at once. It's all laid out on the table. Interesting too, people who have a very strongly active right brain or have the have injury to the corpus callosum, which connects the brains, will report sensations of synesthesia. Right? Synesthesia is where, for instance, also people who are on psychedelic drugs will report this. I look at the beer and I say, ooh, well, I can hear the beer. Okay, that's not possible because a beer is not a sound. But people report these sorts of experiences. This is crossing a conceptual boundary. It does not respect. Well, wait, a beer can't be heard. If you're experiencing synesthesia, it can be heard. And your memory itself, like I talked about with the mnemonic devices, your memory itself works synthetically. It works through association. Anyone who's tried to memorize a table of data by rote knows that it's very difficult. The way you remember events in your life is by tying them to concrete objects, and your memory bank pulls them out through association, not through listening. So anyway, I'm not the only Western scholar in the world to have talked about these issues, and these issues have been very trendy over the last 40 years, maybe, in the fields of what are called systems thinking and cybernetics. I don't have time to really talk about those in depth. Systems thinking, I pulled a brief definition off Wikipedia, is the process of understanding how things influence one another within a whole. In nature, systems thinking examples include ecosystems in which various elements such as air, water, movement, plants, and animals work together to survive or perish. In organizations, systems consist of people, structures, and processes that work together to make an organization healthy or unhealthy. Now, cybernetics is also an interesting field, and it actually has looked at the I Ching because its structure is like that of computer code. It's hexadecimal. So it's very interesting to people of a computer science bent. Cybernetics is applicable when the system being analyzed is involved in a closed signal loop. That is, where action by the system causes some change in its environment, and that change is fed to the system via information, feedback, resonance, that causes the system to adapt to these new conditions. The system's changes affect its behavior. This circular causal relationship is necessary and sufficient for a cybernetic perspective. And a cyberneticist, Louis Kaufman, says, cybernetics is the study of systems and processes that interact with themselves and produce themselves from themselves. So you can think for a moment about what that might apply to. So finally, I'd like to relate an anecdote of a conversation I had with my dad when I was preparing this talk. And he's a psychologist. He's of a scientific bent. He's sympathetic to some of the things I say, but he's more skeptical than I am. And he asked me straight up, well, okay, do you think that the Chinese 12-animal zodiac, do you think it's true? I mean, do you think it's real that, there are 12 animals in the sky and they impact upon people's destiny and fate? And I responded two ways. One, I would like to share a quote with you from a favorite poet of mine, Gary Snyder. I suspect that primary peoples all know that their myths are somehow, quote-unquote, made up. They do not take them literally, and at the same time they hold the stories very dear. Only upon being invaded by history and whipsawed by alien values do a people begin to declare that their myths are quote-unquote literally true. This literalness in turn provokes skeptical questioning and the whole critical exercise. What a final refinement of confusion about the role of myths it is to declare that although they are not to be believed, they are nonetheless aesthetic and psychological constructs which bring order to an otherwise chaotic world, and to which we should willfully commit ourselves. So, the point I'm trying to make is that I think the concept of literally true would not have been comprehensible to the ancient Chinese, or really to any pre-modern people. It's a concept which requires a certain capacity for abstract thinking, and a dualism between something that's abstractly true, that is it true, and does it work, is it good. So in scholastic philosophy terms, you could talk about for primary peoples, the beautiful, the true, and the good are one. For us, they are three. So to them, the justification of the 12-animal zodiac is that it works for making predictions. Basically the argument I'm trying to make. Oh, and then he asked, okay, excuse me, he didn't ask, I said, okay, well, how about this? What if there were 6 organs, 6 elements in the Chinese medical system? Would it still work? My argument is yes. That what makes it work is not that there's a magical entity out there, like earth, water, air, fire, metal. It's that you've arbitrarily chopped reality up into these chunks, and now you can look at the whole data flow coming in, and you can file it under these categories. So you can start really quickly looking at how information relates to other information, much more quickly than if you use the inductive method. Okay. So my conclusion is that by comparison with reductionistic dualism, aka cause and effect, systems thinking has been quite unsuccessful in making useful predictions or discoveries. That's the drawback. This Chinese system of systematic correspondence is one example of an actually existing thought system which has produced useful predictions and discoveries. Therefore, I propose that we ought to take the Chinese cosmology seriously as a resource upon which we can draw for inspiration in developing holistic models of the world. By the same token, the Chinese cosmology can stand as a warning sign for the sorts of superstitious excesses which can result if we indulge too strongly in synthetic reasoning, without using analysis as a check. Finally, I might suggest that there may in fact be no hard and fast distinction between socially acceptable systems thinking and magical thinking, and that we may have to rethink some of our prejudices against magical thought and superstition if we are to overcome the Cartesian impasse. So there you go.